who was partners with L.A. Reid and Babyface in Atlanta, and these guys had this competitiveness. L.A. had a girls group. I bet you don't know who his lead singer was.
No.
Pink.
Uh-huh.
She's the exact same age as Beyonce, and there used to be this battle which group was better. You had Usher. He was the same age. They were all 14 and 15 years old living in Atlanta.
Trainers have been training older artists to lie and say they were as much as 10 years younger than they were. It's all to sell you records, to sell you a...
What if everything you thought you knew about Beyonce wasn't exactly the full story? For decades, Beyonce has been one of the most celebrated artists on the planet. Her talent, her influence, her legacy, all undeniable. But recently, a wave of conversations has been bubbling up online, questioning something surprisingly simple: her age. Now, at first, it sounds ridiculous, right? Why would a global superstar need to hide something like that? But when you start connecting a few unexpected dots, comment from family members like Matthew Knowles, stories from Tina Knowles, and even comparisons involving artists like Pink and Usher, things start to feel a little less clear. Add in alleged documents, old interviews, and a few slip-ups that fans can't seem to ignore, and suddenly the question isn't so crazy anymore. Is this all just internet noise? Or is there a deeper story that's been hiding in plain sight this entire time? Because if even a small part of this turns out to be true, it could completely change how people see the timeline of one of music's biggest icons. Right around the time when the internet really started digging deeper into celebrity timelines, one name kept coming up again and again: Beyonce. Not because of a new album or a performance, but because of a question that seemed almost too simple to matter. How old is she, really? Now, officially, everyone knows the story. Born in 1981, raised in Houston, rising through the ranks with Destiny's Child, and eventually becoming one of the most powerful figures in music. That timeline has been repeated so many times, it feels locked in, untouchable. But what happens when people start noticing small details that don't quite line up? It didn't start with some big investigation or a major news outlet. It started the way most modern controversies do, with clips, old interviews, forgotten conversations, moments that didn't mean much at the time, but years later began to raise eyebrows. One of the most talked about moments involves her father, Matthew Knowles. In an interview, he casually talked about a competitive music scene in Atlanta back in the day. He mentioned young artists all coming up at the same time, groups being formed, rivalries building, careers just started to take shape. And in that conversation, he brought up something that caught people off guard. He said that Beyonce was around the same age as Pink and Usher during those early years. Now, on the surface, that might not sound like a big deal. But when you actually look at the numbers, it raises a question. Pink was born in 1979, Usher in 1978. If Beyonce was truly born in 1981, that would make her noticeably younger. Not exactly the same age, especially in teenage years where even a couple of years can make a big difference. And yet, according to that story, they were all moving through the same spaces at the same time, competing on a level playing field. For some people, that was just a father speaking loosely. But for others, it was the first crack in a very polished narrative. And that's where things started to get interesting. Because once people began questioning one detail, they started looking at everything else a little more closely. Old interviews weren't just interviews anymore. They became clues. Statements weren't just memories. They became potential inconsistencies. Then attention shifted to her mother, Tina Knowles, and a story she told that, at first, seemed completely harmless. She described taking Beyonce to see Michael Jackson during a tour, saying that Beyonce was about 3 years old at the time. According to her, that moment was powerful, something that sparked a realization in her daughter about performing and being on stage. It's a beautiful story, the kind of story that fits perfectly into the origin of a superstar. But then people started looking at the timeline. The tour she referenced, the Triumph Tour, took place in 1981. If Beyonce was born in that same year, the math doesn't really work. A 3-year-old wouldn't exist yet, let alone be attending concerts and forming life-changing memories. Now, to be fair, memory isn't perfect. People mix up dates all the time, especially when they're talking about events that happened decades ago. Some pointed out that she might have meant a different tour, like the Victory Tour in 1984, which would make the timeline fit much better. But by this point, the internet wasn't really in the mood to give the benefit of the doubt, because now it wasn't just one comment. It was two, from two people very close to Beyonce, and both seemed to introduce just a little bit of uncertainty into a story that had always felt completely solid. And once that door opened, more people started stepping in with their own experiences. That's when another name entered the conversation, Gabrielle Union. In an interview, she spoke warmly about her relationship with Beyonce, describing them as having known each other since their teenage years. She talked about shared experiences, mutual respect, and a long-standing connection. Again, on the surface, nothing unusual, but when people compared their ages, questions started to come up. Gabrielle Union is older by nearly a decade, so the idea of them being teenage friends started to feel a little unclear to some observers. Was it possible? Sure, age gaps don't automatically prevent friendships, but in the context of everything else that was already being discussed, it became another piece of a much larger puzzle in the eyes of those following the story. And this is how these kinds of narratives build momentum. Not through one big piece of undeniable evidence, but through a collection of small moments. Each one, on its own, easy to explain, but together, creating a sense, not of proof, but of possibility. Then came another layer, stories from people claiming they had crossed paths with Beyonce in school. One individual recalled being in the same high school environment, remembering her walking the halls, already standing out, already showing signs of the star she would become. It's the kind of story you hear all the time about famous people. Early glimpses of greatness. Nothing unusual there. But once again, timelines became the focus. Ages didn't seem to align perfectly. And for those already questioning things, it felt like more fuel being added to the fire. At this point, the conversation wasn't really about one specific claim anymore. It had evolved into something broader, a general sense that maybe, just maybe, the official version of events wasn't the complete picture. And then came a most controversial part of all, the mention of alleged documents. According to some discussions online, there were claims that records from a Texas health department once suggested a different birth year, one that would place Beyonce several years older than publicly stated. The idea spread quickly, gaining attention and sparking even more debate. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was pushed back. Statements followed saying that the documents couldn't be verified, that they weren't legitimate, that the information wasn't accurate. And yet, by then, it almost didn't matter. Because once an idea like that enters the conversation, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It gets discussed, reinterpreted, reshared. It becomes part of the narrative, whether it's proven or not. And that's really the key to understanding what's happening here. This isn't a story built on confirmed facts or official revelations. It's a story built on perception, on the way small inconsistencies, real or perceived, can grow into bigger questions when enough people start paying attention. At the center of it all is a global icon who has spent decades under the spotlight, where every word, every memory, every detail can be revisited and reanalyzed. So the question becomes, are these just harmless mix-ups and coincidences, the kind that happen in anyone's life story when you stretch it across decades? Or are they something more? Because the deeper people look, the more they feel like there's still something they haven't fully figured out. And if that's true, then this might only be the beginning of a much bigger conversation. By the time these conversations really started gaining traction online, it wasn't just about a few confusing interviews anymore. It had turned into something much bigger. People weren't just listening to what was being said, they were analyzing how it was being said, when it was being said, and why certain details seemed to shift depending on the moment. And once that level of attention kicks in, every small inconsistency starts to feel intentional. That's when the discussion moved beyond family comments and into the wider industry. Because if there's one thing people began to agree on, it's this: adjusting age in entertainment isn't exactly unheard of. In fact, it's been part of the system for decades. There are stories of artists tweaking their birth year to appear younger, especially at the beginning of their careers when image can shape opportunity. Others have done the opposite, adding years to seem more experienced. It's not always about deception. Sometimes it's about positioning. And names started coming up. People pointed to examples like Nelly, who openly admitted to adjusting his age early in his career. Then there's Whoopi Goldberg, who reportedly presented herself as older at one point to gain credibility in the industry. So when people look back at Beyoncé, the question shifted slightly. It wasn't just, is this true, anymore. It became, would it even be surprising if it were? Because now the idea didn't feel impossible. It felt plausible to some. And that's where the narrative really started to take shape. Online forums, comment sections, and video discussions began connecting older clips, building timelines, and comparing statements across years. It became less about any single piece of evidence and more about a pattern people believed they were seeing. One of the biggest talking points was the early Destiny's Child era, the late 90s, when the group was forming and trying to break into the industry. People revisited performances, interviews, and appearances, trying to match how old Beyoncé looked and acted with how old she was said to be at the time. Now, that kind of analysis is highly subjective. Appearance can vary wildly, especially under stage lighting, makeup, and styling. But in the world of internet speculation, perception often carries as much weight as fact. Some viewers felt she appeared more mature than her stated age during those early years. Others completely disagreed. But again, the disagreement itself kept the conversation alive. Then came another layer, the idea of industry training. There's a long-standing belief that young artists are carefully shaped before being introduced to the public. Everything from their image to their backstory can be refined to make them more marketable. And within that belief, some people argue that age could be one of those adjustable details. So when this theory was applied to Beyoncé, it created a narrative that suggested her public timeline might have been strategically crafted from the very beginning. No direct proof, just a theory that fit into a broader perception of how the entertainment industry works. And then, as with many viral discussions, things took an even more dramatic turn. Some voices online began pointing toward Jay-Z, bringing his relationship with Beyoncé into the conversation. If, and this is a big if, her age were different than reported, it could slightly shift how people view the timeline of when they met and started working together. Now, it's important to understand that this part of the discussion is almost entirely speculative. There's no confirmed evidence suggesting anything inappropriate or misleading about their relationship timeline. But in a rumor-driven environment, even hypothetical scenarios can gain attention quickly. And that's exactly what happened. The conversation expanded, pulling in more names, more moments, more interpretations. At some point, it stopped being about verifying facts and started becoming about building a narrative that felt compelling enough to follow. Then there's another angle that kept people talking, the idea of controlled image. Throughout her career, Beyoncé has maintained an extremely polished and private public persona. Interviews are limited. Personal details are carefully shared. Appearances are intentional. And for many fans, that level of control is part of what makes her so iconic. But for skeptics, that same control raises questions. They wonder, if so much of her public image is curated so precisely, could certain personal details also be managed just as carefully? Again, not proof. Just a question that feeds into the larger speculation. And then there's the role of the internet itself. Years ago, a comment made in an interview might fade away quickly. Today, it gets clipped, reposted, slowed down, analyzed, and shared across multiple platforms within hours. Old footage becomes new again. Forgotten statements get a second life. That's exactly what happened here. Clips of Matthew Knowles and Tina Knowles didn't just resurface. They were examined frame by frame, word by word. Tone, hesitation, phrasing, everything became part of the analysis. And when enough people start looking at something that closely, patterns can begin to appear, whether they were originally there or not. That's the tricky part, because human brains are wired to find connections. We look for meaning, for consistency, for explanations. And when something doesn't fit perfectly, we naturally try to fill in the gaps. Sometimes those gaps are filled with facts, other times with assumptions. And in this case, assumptions have played a huge role. Still, one question kept coming back, over and over again. If none of this is true, why hasn't it been fully shut down in a way that satisfies everyone? The answer might be simpler than people think. In many cases, responding directly to every rumor only gives it more attention. For global figures like Beyoncé, silence can be a strategy. Not every claim gets addressed, especially when it doesn't come from a verified or credible source. But for those already invested in the theory, that silence can be interpreted in a completely different way. Not as dismissal, but as avoidance. And that difference in interpretation is what keeps the conversation going. At this point, the story has moved far beyond its starting point. It's no longer just about a birth year. It's about trust, perception, and the way public figures are understood by their audiences. Some people see a collection of coincidences and misremembered details. Others see a pattern that suggests something more deliberate. And the truth is, without clear, verifiable evidence, both sides are left with interpretations rather than conclusions. But one thing is certain, the more people talk about it, the more the story grows. And as it continues to spread, it raises an even bigger question, not just about Beyoncé, but about how easily narratives can form in the digital age and how quickly they can take on a life of their own. Because once a story like this reaches a certain level, it stops needing proof to survive. It just needs attention. And right now, it has plenty of it. At a certain point, the conversation stopped being about numbers, timelines, or even specific interviews, and started becoming something deeper. It turned into a question about perception, how a global icon is seen, understood, and in some cases, reinterpreted by millions of people who have never met her. Because when you really step back and look at it, Beyoncé has spent her entire life in the spotlight. From a young performer in Houston to one of the most powerful entertainers in the world, every phase of her journey has been documented, discussed, and celebrated. But with that level of visibility comes something else, constant scrutiny. And in today's world, scrutiny doesn't just stay on the surface. It goes deeper. It replays old footage. It reanalyzes past interviews. It questions details that once seemed too small to matter. That's exactly how this entire narrative has continued to grow. Because even though none of the claims about her age have been confirmed by credible, official sources, the conversation hasn't slowed down. If anything, it's evolved. It's become less about proving something and more about exploring what if. What if the timeline isn't exactly as it's been presented? What if small inconsistencies actually mean something bigger? What if the entertainment industry really does shape more than just talent? Maybe even personal details. These questions don't come with clear answers, but they do something powerful. They keep people watching. And that's where the internet plays its biggest role. Platforms today are designed to reward engagement. The more a topic gets people talking, debating, and reacting, the more it spreads. And a story like this, one that mixes fame, mystery, and just enough uncertainty, is almost perfectly built for that environment. That's why clips involving Matthew Knowles and Tina Knowles continue to circulate. Not because they provide definitive answers, but because they leave room for interpretation. And interpretation is where speculation lives. Then there's another layer to all of this, the idea of identity versus image. Over the years, Beyoncé has carefully crafted a presence that feels larger than life. Not just as a performer, but as a symbol of excellence, control, and consistency. Every performance is intentional. Every appearance is calculated. Every project feels like it's been designed down to the smallest detail. For fans, that level of precision is part of what makes her legendary. But for skeptics, it raises a different kind of question. If everything we see is so carefully curated, how much of it reflects reality, and how much of it is presentation? Again, there's no direct evidence suggesting that something as specific as her age has been manipulated. But in an environment where people already believe that image is everything, even the possibility becomes enough to keep the conversation alive. And that's the key difference between fact and narrative. Facts require proof. Narratives only require belief. Right now, this story exists firmly in the space of narrative. Because when you break it down logically, every major point has a reasonable explanation. Memory slips happen. Dates get mixed up. People speak casually in interviews without thinking about how their words might be analyzed years later. Even the comparisons with artists like Pink and Usher can be explained as generalizations rather than precise statements. And the so-called documents that were mentioned, they've never been verified in a way that holds up under real scrutiny. But here's the interesting part. Even when explanations exist, they don't always stop speculation. Because speculation isn't driven by certainty, it's driven by curiosity. People want to feel like they're uncovering something hidden, like they're seeing behind the curtain of an industry that often feels polished and controlled. And when a story hints at that possibility, it becomes hard to ignore. That's why this conversation keeps resurfacing, even years after some of these clips first appeared. It's not necessarily because new evidence is being discovered. It's because the story itself is compelling enough to revisit. And in many ways, it says just as much about the audience as it does about the subject. We live in a time where information is everywhere, but trust is complicated. People question official narratives more than ever. They look for inconsistencies. They analyze details. They compare versions of events. Sometimes that leads to real discoveries. Other times, it leads to stories that grow beyond the evidence supporting them. And this situation sits right in the middle of that line. Because on one side, you have a globally recognized timeline that has been accepted for decades. On the other, you have a collection of moments, interviews, comments, and interpretations that don't perfectly align in the eyes of some observers. And between those two sides is where the debate lives. So what's the truth? As of now, the only verifiable information supports the widely known timeline, that Beyonce was born in 1981. That's the date backed by official records, biographies, and decades of consistent reporting. Everything else exists in a different category. Not confirmed, not proven, but also not completely ignored. And that's why the conversation continues. Because in the world of celebrity culture, sometimes the story isn't about what's true or false. It's about what people are willing to question. And right now, this is one of those questions that refuses to go away. Not because it's been proven, but because it's just believable enough to just enough people to keep the discussion alive. And as long as that curiosity exists, stories like this will continue to resurface, evolve, and capture attention over and over again. If you made it this far, then you already know this story isn't as simple as it first sounded. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think everything about Beyonce's timeline is exactly how it's been presented all these years? Or do you believe there's more to the story that people just haven't fully figured out yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to see where you stand on this. And if you enjoyed deep dives like this, where we break down the details, connect the dots, and explore the stories behind some of the biggest names in the world, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because we've got a lot more coming, from industry secrets to celebrity stories that don't always get talked about. Also, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what's coming next. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and I'll see you in the next one.